Hi, Guy. The wind outside is gentle tonight, brushing softly against the windows of memory. There's a hush that falls over history just before sleep, not the silence of forgetting, but the quiet of remembrance. Of crackling wood, of soft voices in dim rooms, of an entire nation holding its breath together and exhaling slowly as one familiar voice begins to speak. Imagine yourself in a small American home. It's winter, 1942. The war has turned distant countries into grim headlines. Ration books sit by the bread box, and outside, the streetlights glow through a film of frost. Inside, someone lowers the lights. The fire is warm and murmuring. The radio hums, waiting, and then his voice. Measured, warm, calm. My friends, let us sit down together again. Franklin Delano Roosevelt didn't just lead a nation, he comforted it. Through the most uncertain hours of the 20th century, he whispered strength into millions of living rooms, one radio at a time. And tonight, we travel quietly back to those nights to sit again by the fire and feel what they felt, not the noise of the war, but the quiet between. Welcome back to Echo. And welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight, we're not here for facts and battles. We're here to slow down time, to place our thoughts gently into the past, like letters in an old cedar drawer. You don't need to remember all the dates. Just listen. Let the rhythm of their lives carry you as the night wraps softly around us. This is the story of Roosevelt's Fireside Nights. Not as a textbook, but as a memory. We will begin with the world beyond the White House, the living rooms, kitchens, and porches of America, where the president's words met wool blankets, cracked coffee mugs, and hands held in hope. We will feel what it was like to live in a time when a voice from the radio felt like an anchor to truth. Then, slowly, we'll turn to the man himself. A quiet room in the White House, a pen scratching across parchment, Eleanor reading quietly in the corner, a flicker in the hearthlight as he rewrites a sentencino for politics. But for understanding, he knows, every word must land gently. You'll hear the echo of a nation's war anxiety, and the balm of leadership not shouted, but spoken softly. Later, we'll explore the power of the voice itself. Why did Roosevelt's tone feel like medicine? What was it about his timing, his pauses, his gentle cadence that kept hearts beating through fear? How did a box of wires and would the radio become a nightly ritual, almost sacred? And finally, we'll reflect on how differently that voice landed in different homes. From luxury apartments in New York to cold farmhouses in Iowa, from frontline barracks to factory dormitories. Yet, in that moment, when he began with, "My friends," every voice paused, every room stilled, every listener belonged. You might find your eyes drifting closed during this journey. That's not a problem at all. You can let go whenever you wish. You're safe here in this space, between now and then, where nothing is urgent, and the past unfolds like the pages of a familiar storybook. Let the names melt into warmth. Let the years become whispers. Let the fire speak. This is not just about Roosevelt. It's about the feeling of being heard, of being reassured, in the darkest hour, that you are not alone. So, make yourself comfortable, loosen the tension behind your eyes. And let's begin where all true comfort begins. By stepping into the quiet lives of ordinary people, gathered together, waiting for a voice in the dark. Life in a 1940s American household during wartime. Imagine the world has shrunk to the size of your living room. It is the winter of 1942. Outside, snow has begun to gather along the edges of the sidewalks, piling gently on rooftops and fence posts, muting the streets in a hush of white. Streetcars rattle by less frequently now, conserving fuel, and families move more quietly through the darkened hours. The blackout curtains have already been drawn tight across the windows. A narrow yellow strip of light glows from underneath the door, falling onto the frozen steps like a whisper. Inside, the warmth of home tries its best to hold steady against the chill of war. It is late evening, and the day's duties have been tucked away. Father's boots rest just inside the door, lined with snow and the faint smell of cold leather and machine oil. He is seated now in his worn armchair, the kind with a small indentation on the right arm where his elbow always settles. He holds a newspaper folded into sections, edges softened from the fold and read ritual repeated night after night. He doesn't read the war headlines anymore, at least not first. He reads the baseball box scores, even in January, even though the season has long ended. He reads the letters to the editor, the obituary names, Anything to keep from seeing that list of cities. Leningrad, Wake Island, Manila. Mother hums to herself in the kitchen, drying her hands on a faded cloth napkin, the scent of boiled potatoes and creamed corn lingering in the air. Dinner was modest, more modest than the year before. Rationing has changed things. Butter is rare. Sugar is even rarer. Canned milk has replaced fresh in the cocoa. And meat, well, the family has learned to make do with bits of salt pork and whatever was left at the butcher. But the warmth of it all, the steam on the windows, the soft hiss of the kettle now off the stove, the clink of plates being stacked brings a comfort money cannot buy. In these times, comfort is homemade. In the front room, a soft amber light glows from a standing lamp whose shade is slightly crooked, but nobody ever fixes it. On the mantel, above the brick fireplace, stands a clock, the kind that ticks with a sound just loud enough to be a presence in the room, but not quite loud enough to be noticed outright. Tick, tick, tick. It marks the passing of seconds the way memories mark time softly, subtly, with the weight of something inevitable. It is past 8 now. The house has taken on its nightly rhythm. The children are here too, 2 of them. The eldest, a boy of 14, sits on the floor in his school uniform shirt, sketching planes in the corner of a math notebook. His pencils are sharpened down to nubs, saved carefully, the rubber erasers already hardened. He draws while he listens, half focused on his world of paper and wings, half attuned to the muffled sound of news playing on the neighbor's radio through the shared wall. The younger child, a girl with a ribbon half loosened in her hair, cuddles her knees on the divan, quietly reading Nancy Drew. She whispers some of the lines aloud, even though she doesn't realize it. Her voice is soft, musical, innocent of the headlines. There is no television, there is only the radio. And though it sits silent now, all heads will soon turn toward it when the president begins to speak. It is a sacred ritual, as trusted and intimate as a family prayer. And in these years, Roosevelt's voice doesn't belong to politicians, it belongs to the people. But not yet. For now, the room lives in the ordinary. Imagine walking through the house, slowly, feeling the soft scuff of woolen slippers across the linoleum of the kitchen floor. The cupboards are thinner than they once were. Empty jars have been rinsed and saved. Bacon grease is kept in a tin near the stove, reused for cooking, sometimes traded, sometimes used to make soap. The refrigerator hums, its metal handle cool and stubborn. The sound of a spoon stirring something thick and sweet inside a chipped ceramic bowl carries a rhythm of patience. This is the hour for pudding, if there is any. Maybe it's rice, made with the leftover milk, cinnamon, if they're lucky. Maybe it's plain, but still warm, still shared. Outside, the world is at war. Inside, the world is waiting. The bathroom mirror shows the soft fatigue of the day on each face. Hands scrubbed red from cold water and hard soap. A bar of Lifebuoy rests in a dish. The scent of Vicks Vapo Rub is a quiet fog in the corners of the hallway. Someone had a cough last week. There's only one bathroom, shared by all. The towels are thin and clean. The silence in the hallway is full of unspoken things. Letters unopened, brothers overseas, headlines folded and turned face down. The bedrooms are modest, quilted, and worn with use. Drawers creak, closets hold coats that smell of mothballs and November rain. Socks are patched, nightgowns are hand-hemmed. A tin of talcum powder stands next to a comb with missing teeth. There is no waste. Everything has a second life. Sheets are turned. Pillowcases are embroidered with tiny, fading flowers. A radio sits on a dresser, flanked by a hairbrush and a photograph in a pewter frame, a boy in uniform, smiling slightly, not knowing what is to come. And yet, even with war, with absence, with all the rationed hours and tightening belts, there is peace in the pattern. There is something sacred in the repetition of daily life, the rhythm of chores, the familiar quiet before bed, the way the house still breathes, no matter what's happening half a world away. Back in the living room, the fire crackles low. Someone has added a single log, and the room glows gold and soft around the edges. The youngest child has dozed off against her mother's lap. The drawing of the airplane is half finished. The room is warm with waiting. Then, a small adjustment. A click. The radio is turned on. It buzzes to life, a slight static, the way radios always begin. A swell of music orchestral, brief, then a pause. And a familiar voice, deeper than memory, begins to speak. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. Every voice hushes, every movement stills, the fire becomes a whisper. And America listens. The soundscape of the living room, fireside radios, and family gatherings. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Not to the noise of today, not to the high-pitched demands of digital life, not the ping of notifications or the hum of fluorescent light, but to something simpler, something deeper. A room where the loudest sound is the tick of a clock, the gentle crackle of firewood, and the soft hush of voices learning how to wait. We return now to a living room, not a grand salon or a gilded hall, but a room with a faded rug, threadbare in the middle from decades of footsteps. A room that has known laughter, arguments, and silence. A room where, each evening, life settles like dust into corners, and people gather not to escape one another, but to listen. It begins with the fire. Always the fire. It anchors the space like a low heartbeat. The sound is not loud but constant. A quiet crackle, punctuated now and then by the pop of a sap bubble bursting inside the log. The fire doesn't speak, but it fills the pauses, and it teaches you how to listen. Slowly, patiently, with warmth and weight. Chairs creak gently as people shift in them. A spring inside the couch offers a quiet squeak when someone leans back. Slippers shuffle across the floor, soft soles brushing the worn wood or the rug's faded threads. A teacup touches saucer with a sound so familiar, so faint, it becomes part of the room's breath. A spoon stirs just once, maybe twice, and is left to rest beside a warm mug of chicory or cocoa, steam trailing upward, caught briefly in the lamplight before fading. The radio stands in the corner like a trusted elder tool, wooden and serious in its shape. It is not just an appliance, it is a member of the family, a voice box for the world, a storyteller, a comforter, a witness. It hums gently as it warms up, as if clearing its throat, preparing to speak. Outside the radio's reach, the room is full of soundlessness, not silence, but a suspended kind of waiting. A waiting that is both collective and intimate. You don't speak while the radio speaks. You barely move. You lean forward without realizing it. You hold your breath during the pauses, and somehow, without trying, you begin to synchronize with your family, with the nation, with the man who is about to speak. Before the program begins, there is often music. A single violin, a brass swell, sometimes patriotic, sometimes somber. It opens the door into the message. And then there is that voice. Roosevelt's voice. He never shouted, he never rushed. He didn't lecture or proclaim, he invited. There is something deeply human in the way his voice entered a room. It was not theatrical, nor detached. It was measured, slow, like a conversation by the fire. He knew the rhythm of ordinary life. He knew that people needed more than just information. They needed reassurance. They needed to hear that someone understood the depth of their fears and still believed in tomorrow. So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Imagine those words landing in a room that had no central heating, no full pantry, no certainty about the next monthlet, alone the next year. Imagine how the simple cadence of Roosevelt's sentences, his pauses, his careful repetition of key phrases began to settle the room, like ash in a chimney, like snow over troubled ground. Children would sit up straight or not, out of discipline, but curiosity. Teenagers would lean their heads against their hands, eyes unfocused but minds alert. Mothers would stop knitting. Fathers would reach for their pipes but forget to light them. The radio would glow amber from within, and Roosevelt's voice would fill the room not loudly, but completely. And the room listened, like a chapel. If a car drove by outside, the engine would be a disturbance. If the phone rang, no one would answer. The sounds of the living room narrowed. The clock seemed to tick more quietly. Even the fire, it seemed, burned in rhythm with the voice. He would speak for 20 minutes, maybe 30, and the room would hold its breath the entire time. There were only a few stations, no fast-forwarding, no skipping ahead, and so the family listened to every word, the tone, the tempo, the carefully chosen metaphors. Roosevelt didn't just report the news, she told stories. He painted pictures. He invited the listener to imagine themselves as participants in something larger. He gave structure to chaos, meaning to suffering, direction to uncertainty. Even after the voice stopped, the room held still for a while. People didn't speak immediately. They sat in that hush, the sacred pause after connection. The fire continued, The clock resumed. Someone sipped from their cup. A child asked what arsenal of democracy meant. The room returned to itself, but not quite the same. And then, the smaller sounds returned. The scraping of chairs as they were pushed back, the rustle of a newspaper being unfolded again, a match striking to light a pipe. The dog sighing as it resettled its head on someone's foot. The murmur of two voices in the kitchen, wondering if the butter coupon would stretch another week. But the voice lingered. It always lingered. It lingered in the hallway, where someone pinned up a small flag with a blue star on it, thinking of a brother overseas. It lingered in the attic, where letters from the front were kept in boxes tied with ribbon. It lingered in the basement, among the jars of home-canned beans and pickles, stored away, just in case. It lingered in the ache between bedtime and sleep. This soundscape wasn't loud, but it was deep. It was a tapestry of ritual, repetition, and reverence. It was a nation learning to breathe together, in firelight and static. Later, when the room darkened fully and the radio was turned off, the lingering warmth of the voice would be remembered, not in words, but in feeling, in the steady beat of calm, in the invisible sense that someone somewhere was at the helm. And so, as we drift gently forward through this night of memory, let us carry with us that hush, that reverent, golden hush of a family gathered not in fear, but in hope. Let the sounds fade in your mind now, the fire crackling low, the radio gone to sleep, the chairs no longer creaking. You are now in the stillness after the voice. And from here, we will step into the rhythm of daily life itself, its textures, its foods, its small worries and quiet joys. The soundscape remains with us, as we listen now to the world that waited for it. What Americans cooked, wore, read, and feared. In the quiet warmth of a 1940s American home, life unfolded not in sweeping headlines or presidential addresses, but in the texture of daily things, the scent of dinner simmering on the stove, the feel of worn fabric against skin, the pages of a book creased by fingertips, the thoughts one never spoke aloud but carried like a folded letter deep in the chest. The war was everywhere, and yet, in many ways, it was also nowhere. It was felt in the absence of people, in the rationing cards tucked into kitchen drawers, in the empty hooks where coats used to hang. But most of all, it was felt in the altered rhythm of the ordinary. And so tonight, we pause herein the domestic world of the 1940 snot to observe it as outsiders, but to step gently inside it, with the soft curiosity of someone entering an old room where everything has a reason for being kept. Let us begin with the kitchen. Not the modern kitchen of gleaming countertops and humming appliances, but a simpler place where everything had a place and nothing was wasted. The stove was often enamel, rounded at the corners, with black iron burners that hissed and popped as they heated. A kettle sat perpetually atop it, not just for tea, but for warmth, for moisture in the dry winter air, and for the quiet comfort of its sighing steam. The pantry was modest. A row of tin cans green beans, tomato soup, peaches in syrup stood like soldiers in formation. Above them, bags of flour and cornmeal were sealed with string, and sometimes reused from cloth sacks that would later be turned into dresses or aprons. Butter was rationed, so was sugar, so were eggs. The weekly challenge was not what to cook, but how to make it last. People became inventors of frugality. War cake, for instance, was made without eggs, milk, or butter, a dense, spiced treat that relied on raisins, boiling water, and ingenuity. Coffee was often stretched with chicory or dandelion root. Meatless Mondays were not a lifestyle choice, but a necessity. Victory gardens sprang up in backyards, and empty lots rows of carrots, beets, and cabbage growing proudly beside clotheslines and bicycle tires. Leftovers were not just eaten, they were transformed. Yesterday's roast became today's hash, bones became broth, bread heels became stuffing, and grease saved from bacon would be folded into cornbread, or even turned over to collection centers for military use. The smells of cooking were less about indulgence and more about memory. A loaf of bread baking filled the house with warmth far beyond its calories. The tang of vinegar used in preserving cucumbers recalled summer, even in the bleakness of January. Even a simple stew, onions, potatoes, a marrow bone became a kind of ritual, stirred slowly, silently, with wooden spoons worn smooth by years of hands. And when dinner was ready, it was served on chipped plates, handed down or pieced together from sales at the 5 and dime. Napkins were cloth, reused and starched. Cups didn't match, but it didn't matter. Food was shared with gratitude and quiet resilience. Families sat close, chairs pulled in tight, passing dishes and stories in equal measure. After the meal came the clothes, the daily armor of wartime life. In the 1940s, clothing was not fast nor disposable. It was sewn, mended, shared, and outgrown only slowly. A woman's dress might be made from a man's old shirt, turned and tucked until it fit a new purpose. Buttons were removed and saved in jars. Zippers were replaced by hand. Socks were darned. Underwear was patched. And aprons so. The aprons each told a story. Some were floral, some striped, some made from flour sacks with brand logos still faintly visible. An apron wasn't just a garment. It was a shield against flour dust, grease spatters, and the slow unraveling of things. Men, when home, wore slacks and suspenders, and always a tucked-in shirt. Even those with coal dust on their skin or motor oil under their nails dressed with a certain pride. Shoes were shined. Hats were brushed. And for Sunday best there was always one tie, carefully hung on a single hanger, and perhaps one pair of gloves wrapped in tissue paper inside a drawer. Children's clothes were passed down, hemmed up, let out, or simply refashioned. A coat that once belonged to a cousin 3 states away might now find its place on the shoulders of a girl walking to school. Sweaters were knitted by hand, sleeves slightly uneven, but warm with the labor of love. Wool itched, collars pinched. But these were the textures of the time, of scarcity, yes, but also of care. Books offered an escape aimed, not just for the children. In many homes, a small shelf held beloved titles: The Grapes of Wrath, Gone with the Wind, Rebecca, perhaps a volume of Shakespeare or a dog-eared Bible. Families read aloud together, not as a performance, but as an anchor. Children fell asleep to the sounds of Little Women or Treasure Island being read slowly, gently, by lamplight. Magazines, when available, brought the outside world closer life. The Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest full of glossy pages, advice columns, war updates, and advertisements that promised better days ahead. There was always something being read. Even ration guides and pamphlets on air raid preparedness became bedside reading. Reading was not just a pasta meat, was an act of connection, a way of finding yourself on a page, even when everything around you was changing. And yet, beneath the smell of stew, the feel of wool, and the rustle of newspaper, there was something else too. There was fear. Not loud, not panicked, but ever present. It seeped in at night, when the house grew still and the fire burned low. Fear that a telegram would arrive. Fear that a familiar voice on the radio would change its tone. Fear of empty shelves, of illness, of saying goodbye too quickly, of never saying it at all. Mothers watched their sons pack for war, folding socks into tight rolls, tucking letters into pockets. Wives wrote to husbands on the front, careful not to ask too much, careful not to say too little. Children whispered questions no one could answer, and those who remained behind bore the fear quietly, like a stone in the coat pocket always there, even when laughter returned. But even fear became part of the rhythm, part of the tapestry. It was stitched into the seams of daily life, accepted, adapted to, and softened by the rituals that held the rest of the world together. Food, clothes, books, worries, they were not separate, they were one. And so as we sit now, in this remembered room of soft light and steady warmth, we see that daily life was not a backdrop to history. It was history. A loaf of bread, a second-hand coat, a dog-eared novel passed hand to hand. These were the battlegrounds of dignity. These were the victories of the home front. Let them linger in your thoughts now, not as relics, but as echoes. The scent of cinnamon in a kitchen without sugar. The feel of wool against your skin, stitched by someone who loved you. The whisper of a page turning in the quiet. The silence after a letter was read aloud. These are the sounds and shapes of an era. And now, we move to the hour when all of them gathered. When Americans set down their forks, folded their sleeves, turned off the lights, and listened. A night waiting for Roosevelt's voice. The experience of listening live. It begins long before the broadcast. Not with the voice itself, but with the quiet preparations, slowing down of the evening, a shifting of the house into gentle attentiveness. It begins when the hour draws near and someone glances at the clock on the mantel, the one with the pendulum that swings like the breath of the house itself. The hands point just past 7. Supper has been cleared. The fire has been stirred. and a certain stillness begins to settle over the furniture, the floorboards, the faces of those inside. You see it in the small things. A cushion plumped, a shawl draped over someone's shoulders, a child's head tilted expectantly. The room gathers itself. The lights are dimmed slightly, not too much, just enough to let the amber glow of the radio feel warmer, more essential. This is not just about hearing, it is about receiving. The room prepares itself, the way a church prepares for service. Not through command, but through quiet ritual. Someone adjusts the dial on the radio, not out of necessity, but ceremony. The station has already been set, of course. It always is. But the dial is still turned gently to reaffirm the moment. The click is soft. Static crackles briefly, then vanishes. And the radio breathes into its warm, waiting hum. In the corner of the room, a child curls under a blanket. Not yet asleep, but close. Her eyes are half-lidded, and her thumb brushes the edge of the quilt with slow, rhythmic movement. Her brother sits cross-legged on the floor, his elbows resting on his knees, watching the radio as if it were a stage. Father leans forward, forearms on thighs, hands clasped. Mother pours tea into 2 ceramic cups, thin china, slightly chipped at the rim. She doesn't speak. No one does. Because this is not just a broadcast. This is Roosevelt. And in the 1940s, that meant something more than politics or power. It meant comfort. It meant reassurance. It meant someone in Washington still remembered how ordinary Americans lived and how much they needed not just answers but calm. Outside, the street is hushed. No cars pass. The blackout curtains are drawn tight. Somewhere down the road, another radio echoes faintly through a neighbor's window. You can't make out the words yet, but you recognize the pattern, the breath between sentences, the slow clarity of emphasis. Soon, that voice will be in your living room too. Not as an interruption, but as an arrival. Inside, the warmth deepens. The fire hisses softly, the way it does when a small knot in the wood gives way. The teacups clink gently on their saucers. The clock ticks on. It's nearly time. And then, the music. A brief orchestral swell, faint and distant, like a curtain rising. No fanfare, no dramatics, just a signal. A quiet acknowledgement that something is beginning. The family leans slightly forward, instinctively, as if pulled toward the speaker. A few seconds of static, a soft clearing of the airwaves. Then, my friends. Just 2 words. And yet, they change the room. There is no mistaking it, no imitation, no substitute. That voice, low, assured, slightly nasal, carefully paced, belongs to no one else. Roosevelt doesn't read from a podium. He speaks. And not to Congress, or generals, or party leaders. He speaks to you. He speaks like someone who has just sat down beside you, removed his overcoat, and is ready to have a thoughtful conversation over coffee. I want to talk for a few minutes tonight with the people of the United States. The room stills. No one interrupts. No one shifts in their seat. Even the fire seems to quiet, as if respectfully allowing space for the president to speak. He tells stories. He uses simple words. He explains complex events in a way that feels like he's telling you about your own street, your own city, your own life. He talks of banks, of steel, of battleships, of liberty, of sacrifice, of hope. And though the words vary from night to night, the feeling is always the same. Someone is guiding us through the fog. You hear the occasional creak of a chair as someone leans closer. You see the flicker of reflection in the window glass, the firelight, the radio glow, the outline of a father's brow furrowed not in worry, but in thought. A mother's hand rests gently on her child's shoulder. No one says, shh. They don't need to. The moment speaks for itself. In kitchens across the country, working women with flour on their aprons stand with arms crossed, listening while drying dishes. In small-town barbershops, where families have gathered shoulder to shoulder after hours, the voice crackles from a wall-mounted set. In city apartments, 6 floors up, with radiator heat clanking in the background, a widow listens with her hand on a letter she still reads once a week. In barns and bunkhouses, factories and parlors, foxholes and front porches, America listens. No other sound competes. Even the pets lie still, dogs curled near feet, cats tucked behind the warmth of a stove. The only movement is in the flickering of shadows cast by lamps, by fire, by breath. Roosevelt's voice is not dramatic, but it has weight. He pauses, he repeats, he explains, he reassures. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. These are not just lines, they are lifelines. Not because they promise ease, but because they promise understanding. They offer dignity to the listener. They affirm that even in war, the people matter. Even in uncertainty, someone is steering the ship. The chat ends gently, without spectacle, without applause. A closing thought, a final phrase, then silence. No music this time, just the soft static of the airwaves closing. Then the click of the dial as someone turns the radio off. The family remains seated for a moment longer. A long breath. A few exchanged glances. No need to speak. The voice is still with them. The fire has dimmed now, its glow a pulsing ember. The room, once filled with anticipation, now feels like exhale. The kind of deep release that comes when the unknown has been spoken aloud, and you've been reminded that you are not facing it alone. The clock ticks. The kettle is returned to the stove for one last cup. The children are carried off to bed, or led with sleepy eyes and dragging slippers. The blankets are folded, the light turned down, the door locked gently. Life resumes not different, but steadier. Because that is what Roosevelt gave in those quiet chats. Not solutions, not certainties, but steadiness. And in the darkest times, steadiness is everything. As the room fades now in your memory, imagine the hum of the radio returning to silence. Imagine the faint scent of ash and tea, the softness of wool, the warmth of being close, the echo of a voice that asked only to be heard. And now, we leave this room. With the fire low, the words still drifting gently through the quiet of the night, we turn now to the next part of our journey where that voice came from, and what it meant to be the man who spoke into so many homes, into so many hearts. A quiet night in the White House. FDR's speechwriting ritual. Long after most windows in Washington have gone dark, long after the click of typewriters has fallen silent in the offices below, and long after the halls of the West Wing have emptied of urgent footsteps and half-spoken policy debates, the White House itself takes on another mood entirely. A quieter, softer rhythm begins to pulse through its corridor, sun-hurried, reflective, steeped in the weight of history but unburdened by its spectacle. This is the hour when the House, though never truly asleep, breathes more slowly, when it exhales. And in a small, lamplit study on the second floor, behind closed doors, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sits alone at his desk, writing. The clock on the mantel ticks just as it does in every American household, though here, it sounds louder perhaps because it has fewer voices to compete with at this hour. The fire crackles gently in the hearth, casting long shadows on the edges of the rug and dancing softly across the framed photographs on the wall. There is no fanfare, no fuss. The room is not grand in the way one might expect. It is warm, intimate, functional, a wooden desk, a pile of books, a carafe of water beside a ceramic cup, a single reading lamp pooling golden light onto the surface below. Roosevelt leans forward slightly, his chair creaking ever so softly beneath his weight. A blanket lies across his legs. His pen moves slowly, deliberately, in his hand no longer for show, but with intention. Not the quick scribble of campaign slogans or policy briefs, but something more personal, more careful. These are the hours in which he writes, not as a politician, but as a companion to a nation. Imagine him now, the firelight soft against his cheek, his eyes narrowed not in frustration, but focus. He reads over a sentence he has just written, mouth moving silently as he tests its rhythm. He is not just choosing the right words, he is choosing the right tone, the exact weight of a pause, the tempo of a thought. Because he knows, somewhere far from here, in a farmhouse in Nebraska or a brownstone in New York, a family will be listening not just with their ears, but with their hearts. And so the words must land softly, yet surely. Sometimes he writes alone. Other times, one of his speechwriters, Samuel Rosenman or Harry Hopkins, sits nearby, offering quiet thoughts, helping shape ideas into phrases that will not just inform, but soothe. But in these hours past midnight, with the fire burning low and the house wrapped in hushit, is often just him, and the page, and the long, silent weight of what the nation needs to hear. The ritual is almost meditative. First, he reads, not speeches, but letters. Roosevelt kept thousands of them, handwritten letters from farmers, teachers, factory workers, mothers with sons overseas. He would read them slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes more than once. They reminded him why the words mattered. They reminded him who the words were for. Then he would dictate or write by hand, a sentence at a time, sometimes erasing, sometimes rewriting entire paragraphs because a single phrase felt too cold, too distant. He would test metaphors like tuning an instrument, trying to find the one that would resonate without rousing fear. He often used imagery, drawn from daily life: baking bread, sailing ships, drawing curtains, because he knew that complexity did not comfort, clarity did. There is a rhythm to his process, a kind of gentle architecture. He begins by acknowledging reality honestly, plainly, without evasion. Whether it was the Depression or the war, Roosevelt never ignored hardship, but he never lingered there either. From there, he moves to explanation simple, even when the subjects are enormous. Then to reassurance, and finally, to belief. Belief in the listener, belief in the country, belief that the night, no matter how long, would end in dawn. The writing process is interrupted only by small, quiet moments. Eleanor might enter the room, carrying a cup of tea, her presence calm and grounding. They exchange a few words sometimes about the speech, sometimes not. She often brings him fragments of conversation from her travels, what people are saying, what they fear, what they hope. Her voice, gentle and observant, blends into the quiet like another layer of the fire's warmth. And then she leaves, softly closing the door behind her, and he continues. At one point, he lays down his pen and leans back. He listens not to music, not to advisors, but to the silence. Because in that silence, he imagines the living rooms he will soon enter through the radio waves. He imagines the tension in a father's shoulders, the worry behind a mother's eyes, the questions in a child's voice. He doesn't need to be in the room with them. He knows what it means to feel vulnerable. He knows what it means to search for steadiness. And that is what he writes toward: not solutions, but steadiness. The pages are neatly stacked, revised, and read again. At times, he dictates portions to be typed up the next morning. Other times, he keeps them as scribbled notes, waiting for a final pass. His handwriting is firm, almost architectural confident, even in fatigue. The fire has burned down now to coals, glowing soft and red in the grate. Outside, the branches of the trees sway in the moonlight. The house is quiet. A silence filled not with emptiness, but with purpose. This is not the Roosevelt of rallies or campaign trails. This is not the orator standing behind podiums with cameras flashing. This is the Roosevelt who sits in the solitude of leadership. The Roosevelt who knows that the voice you send into the night must be earned. That comfort, when it comes from a position of power, is only meaningful if it arrives humbly, as an offering, not a performance. And so he writes, not to impress, not to convince, but to reach. This is what makes the Fireside chats different from every other speech. They were not about Roosevelt, they were about the bond between speaker and listener. About a voice that could pass through wood and wire, through silence and worry, through loneliness and fear, and arrive as something human. As the hour grows late, Roosevelt closes the notebook. He turns the lamp slightly downward. The room is bathed in amber and gold. A final glance at the fire. A small breath out. Another night of quiet work, done. In a few days, the voice will echo across the country, and none will hear the creak of the chair, the scratch of the pen, the shifting of logs in the fireplace that preceded it. But those details, the stillness, the effort, the care, will live inside the words. You may not notice them, but you will feel them. Because that is how trust is built. Not through volume, but through presence. And now, as we leave this quiet night in the White House behind, the fire fading into memory and the papers tucked gently away, we turn to the world outside that door, to the people who helped shape those words, and the people those words were meant to reach. His inner circle, Eleanor, aides, and the voice of the people. If you were to sit just outside the frame of those famous moments beyond the radio, beyond the voice, you would find that Roosevelt's fireside presence was not conjured alone. It was shaped, nurtured, and carefully guarded by a constellation of people whose work began before the words were ever spoken. They didn't write headlines, they weren't household names. But in the warm orbit around Roosevelt's quiet strength stood voices, hearts, and minds that formed the inner ring of trust. They carried stories. They softened the sharp edges of policy. They reminded the president, with quiet constancy, that behind every bill and budget was a family, a worker, a widow, a child. These were the people he wrote for, and These were the people who helped him remember how. Let us begin with Eleanor. Not merely a first lady, and never just a figurehead, Eleanor Roosevelt was his conscience in human form. Where Franklin wielded calm, Eleanor carried empathy. She traveled relentlessly. Not to banquets and ceremonies, but to hospitals, schools, labor camps, and towns so small they barely existed on maps. While he remained, by necessity and condition, rooted in Washington, she became his eyes and ears across a restless, wounded country. She brought back stories, not statistics, not summaries, but people. The girl who had worn her brother's boots to school because her shoes were too thin. The veteran with shell shock who now sold pencils on the street corner. The factory worker whose lunch was cut in half, so her children wouldn't go without. And she didn't simply report these things to Franklin, she carried them into the room with her presence. In her tone, in her pause before speaking, in the way she'd stand quietly until she knew he was ready to hear. They were not always in agreement. Their letters reveal a relationship full of challenge and questioning, but never without love. In the soft hours of the evening, she might sit nearby as he shaped a speech. She would listen as he read lines aloud, sometimes nodding, sometimes gently objecting with a quiet, "Do you think they'll understand that?" She was not critical. She was protective of the people, of the integrity of the message, and he trusted her for that. Then there was Harry Hopkins, the pale, lanky advisor with dark eyes and relentless purpose. He lived in the White House during the war, literally just down the Halland, became not just Roosevelt's political brain, but one of the few who could speak plainly to power. Hopkins had no interest in theatrics. He cared about people having work, food, dignity. And so, when Roosevelt shaped a fireside chat, Harry might sit across the desk, tapping a pencil, asking, "But what does this mean to a steelworker in Pittsburgh? What does it mean to someone who didn't finish high school? Say it again, but simpler." Hopkins believed that the president must always speak in a language that felt like home. And Roosevelt, for all his polish and patrician background, agreed. Not because he was pandering, but because he believed that democracy required shared language. If the people couldn't understand their government, they couldn't trust it. So Hopkins, quiet, insistent, loyal, kept the message clear, grounded, and human. Beside him, often working into the same smoky night, was Samuel Rosenman, Roosevelt's chief speechwriter and the architect of many of his most elegant turns of phrase. Sam was a careful craftsman. He believed in the weight of language, in its music and structure. He refined Roosevelt's thoughts without dulling them, and most importantly, he listened. He would watch Roosevelt read a line aloud, hear where the rhythm faltered, where the meaning dissolved, and start again, sculpting not just sentences, but cadence. Together, they worked as an almost musical trio: Roosevelt, Hopkins, and Rosenman. One carried the moral imperative, one carried the public ear, one carried the pen, and yet none of them acted alone. Around them swirled dozens more typists, secretaries, radio technicians, economic advisors, pollsters, wives, guards. The house was never still for long, and yet, in those hours before a broadcast, a particular hush would fall, not of reverence, but of focus. These were not only professionals, many were close friends, trusted allies, people who had stood with Roosevelt for years through polio, through defeat, through landslides and backlash alike. They understood not just what he stood for, but how he needed to deliver it. Because they knew that voice wasn't just a political tool, it was a promise. And a promise had to be written with care. Even outside the halls of the White House, there were voices that reached in, the letters. Each week, thousands of handwritten messages arrived, many scrawled in pencil, some on the backs of grocery lists, others in trembling cursive that bore the strain of age or anxiety. And Roosevelt read them. Not all, of course, but enough. Enough to hear what mattered, enough to be reminded of the trust placed in him. The woman in Kansas who asked if her husband would ever come home. The boy who asked if the president believed God was still watching. The farmer who wondered if the banks would let him keep his land just one more year. Sometimes, Roosevelt would circle a sentence in a letter and hand it to an aide, saying, "This is the point. Let's build from here." Other times, he would keep the letter beside him as he wrote an anchor to the world beyond the marble walls. Together, this inner circle functioned not as a team of politicians, but as keepers of tone. They understood that in an age of fear, the wrong word could unravel weeks of trust. And they treated that responsibility with gravity, but never with rigidity. The process was full of laughter too, of stories, of sighs and long pauses. It was human work, sacred work, the shaping of reassurance. And when the words were finally typed up, reviewed, rehearsed, the real preparation began. The broadcast room, though not glamorous, would be arranged with meticulous care. Microphones tested, volumes balanced, timing exact. Roosevelt, seated with his notes, would lean in and become once again not the president, but the voice. And behind the scenes, the inner circle would wait not tensely, but tenderly. They knew the message would land. They had helped make it so. And so, when we remember the fireside chats, we must not remember only the singular voice, but the chorus behind it. The minds that questioned, the hearts that reminded, the hands that drafted, the love that filtered in through Eleanor's quiet truths, the care that guided every comma and every pause. Because Roosevelt's voice did not echo alone. It carried the wisdom of his wife, the clarity of his aides, the ache of the people. And in that, it became not a performance, but a partnership. As we let these quiet figures return to their places in memory, now no spotlight, no applause, we carry forward what they built together. A voice that listened before it spoke, and a message that always remembered its audience. The evolution of the fireside chat, how it began, how it changed the nation. Before it became a symbol, before it became a lifeline whispered through static, before the world knew to quiet itself and lean in when it heard the first three words. My friends, the fireside chat was not an institution. It was a necessity. It was an experiment. It was a moment of intuition, born not from strategy, but from listening. And like all things destined to endure, it began simply. It was 1933. America was shivering in the long shadow of the Great Depression. Banks had failed. Unemployment had exploded. Breadlines curled around corners like scars. The stock market was not just broken, it was feared. Confidence, the invisible fuel of a functioning economy, had vanished into dust. And amidst this backdrop of financial paralysis and quiet despair, Franklin D. Roosevelt had just taken office. His inauguration was urgent, even ominous. In that first speech, standing beneath a grey sky and speaking with unshaken calm, he delivered the now immortal line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And yet, even then, he knew that words alone from a marble platform were not enough. What the country needed was not just a president, it needed a presence. And so, 8 days later, he tried something new, something quiet, something radical in its simplicity. On the 12th of March, 1933, Roosevelt sat down behind a radio microphone in the White House and spoke not to Congress, not to reporters, not to officials, but directly to the American people. There was no crowd, no applause, no ceremony, just a wooden table, a stack of handwritten notes, and a single microphone that hummed with anticipation. The subject was the banking crisis, a dry, technical, almost painfully abstract topic. But Roosevelt didn't open with jargon. He opened with a chair, a metaphor, a shared seat beside a fire. He explained what had gone wrong, how banks work, why they had failed, why closing them temporarily was a good thing. He didn't simplify to the point of insult, nor did he dazzle with flourish. He simply explained with the calm of a neighbor and the cadence of a teacher. He told the truth, but he told it gently, as if speaking to someone he cared about. And across the country, millions leaned closer. They didn't call it a fireside chat that night. That term would come later, coined by a reporter and quickly adopted by the people. But the spirit was already there. A conversation, not a speech. A voice, not a decree. The effect was immediate. On Monday morning, just one day after Roosevelt's first broadcast, banks began reopening. And instead of panicked withdrawals, people deposited their money. Confidence returned, not because of new laws, but because of new trust. Trust in the voice that had taken the time to explain, to connect, to respect the intelligence and fears of ordinary Americans. And so the chats continued. Over the next 11 years, Roosevelt would give 30 more fireside chats, each one carefully timed, each one tailored to the moment's need. Some addressed domestic policy, others, the war. Some were hopeful, others, sobering, but all carried the same hallmarks: clarity, warmth, and steadiness. They were never frequent. Roosevelt understood the power of restraint. He saved his broadcasts for moments when the nation truly needed to be spoken to, not at, but with. Sometimes months passed between them. But when the next one came, families would gather again, just as they had before, ready to listen, ready to be reminded that they were not alone in the dark. As the years passed, the style of the fireside chat evolved subtly, like a river wearing gently into stone. The early chats were deeply explanatory, focused on unraveling policy knots, restoring confidence, and teaching a nation how its government worked. Roosevelt, the tutor, the guide, the calm inside the storm. But when the World War arrived, the tone shifted. He no longer had the luxury of assurance. Now he had to balance honesty with hope. He spoke of sacrifice not in a detached way, but as a shared burden. He honored soldiers, not as symbols, but as sons and brothers. He spoke of distant battles in far-off places, Normandy, the Pacific, the skies above London, but always through the lens of the listener at home. The war was never framed as their fight. It was ours. One of the most memorable chats came in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's voice was heavier, slower, but never trembling. He laid out the facts, named the enemy, described the path ahead. And though there was fear palpable, thick in the air, his tone was not one of panic, it was one of resolve. We are now in this war, we are all in it all the way. And Americans believed him, not because he asked them to, but because he had earned that belief, over years of sitting beside them, not on stages, but on radios, in kitchens and parlors and dormitories and bunkhouses, again and again and again. Each chat followed a structure. Roosevelt would begin with the emotional pulse, naming the fear, the moment, the stakes. Then, the explanation, what was happening, why it mattered. Then, the guidance, what the government was doing, what the people could do. And finally, always, a recentering in unity, in common destiny. In the idea that America was strongest, not when loudest, but when together. He rarely used anger, almost never used blame. Even when scolding, he was composed. Even when celebrating, he was modest. That tone, detached but warm, firm but forgiving, became the foundation of what we now call presidential voice. Not just as a tool of governance, but as a mirror to the nation's soul. And over time, the fireside chat became more than a broadcast. It became a ritual. Children knew to be quiet. Fathers cleared their schedules. Radios were cleaned and tuned. Some households lit candles, purely for ambiance. Some took notes. Others simply sat, heads bowed, eyes closed, allowing the voice to wash over them like a hymn. In an age of shouting, Roosevelt chose softness. In a world of confusion, he chose simplicity. And in a culture that prized distance between rulers and ruled, he chose closeness. That is what changed the nation. Not the radio, but what the radio carried. Not the message, but the manner. It taught Americans what it meant to be spoken to with care. It taught leaders what it meant to earn trust through tone. It reminded everyone that democracy, at its best, feels like a conversation, not a command. And now, with the fire burning low in this memory, we step away from the microphone, not in silence, but in reverence. The man who spoke is gone. The broadcasts are silent. But the form remains. Because now, whenever a leader leans into a camera, speaks slowly, and begins with, "Let me explain," you can trace that moment back here, to this chair, this voice, this fire. And so we carry the echo forward, not just in politics, but in the way we speak to one another, gently, clearly, with care. The fireside chat may have ended, but its warmth remains. The 1942 chat, the war's darkest winter, and the calm within. The winter of 1942 did not arrive quietly. It came with headlines etched in shadow, with newscasts that spoke of loss measured not in numbers but in namesons, neighbors, husbands. The world outside was wrapped in snow, yes, but also in silence. A silence that carried the weight of uncertainty. A silence that settled thickly over factory towns and family farms, over crowded train stations and sparsely lit bedrooms, over America itself. The war, once distant, now pressed against the very door. It had been 1 year since Pearl Harbor, 1 year since Roosevelt had gone on the air and named the storm. And now, 12 months later, the storm had become a season. Soldiers were dying in places many couldn't pronounce, places marked with ice, or jungle heat, or ocean salt. Europe was braced beneath iron rule. The Pacific was a theater of uncertainty. In every American town, the war was not something discussed in abstraction. It lived in empty chairs. It lived in telegrams. It lived in a young mother walking to the mailbox slowly, her heart caught in her throat. And it lived in the cold. That December, coal was scarce. Heating oil was rationed. Blankets were patched. Drafts crept under doorways like ghosts. Children slept in pairs to stay warm. Women stirred soup slowly on the stove, stretching one potato across 3 bowls. The trees had lost their leaves. The days ended too soon. And the nights were long, not just in hours, but in the way they folded quietly into the mind. This was a different kind of winter. Not just meteorological, not just military, but emotional. A season defined not only by its conditions, but by its questions. How long? Will he return? What does victory really mean? Will it be enough? Will we still be whole when it ends? In such a time, speeches were not what the people needed. They needed something slower, warmer, more human. And so, on the 24th of December, 1942, Christmas Eve, Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat down by the fire once again and gave a voice to what so many had been holding silently in their hearts. This was the 23rd Fireside chat. And though the country had changed since his first broadcast in 1933, and the world had tilted further into chaos, Roosevelt's tone had not. His voice was still low, measured, warm without being dramatic, certain without being boastful, and as always, personal. "It is not easy to say Merry Christmas to you tonight," he began, "because we are at war." There was no illusion, no attempt to coat the bitter truths in sugar. The words rang clear, heavy, quiet, but Roosevelt knew something, that naming a sorrow often makes it less sharp. That giving voice to the silence can soften its grip. He spoke not to dazzle but to dwell beside the listener, to sit, as always, across from the fire and speak as one person to another. He acknowledged the longing, the separation of families, the sons missing from Christmas tables, the quiet behind the carols. He spoke of sacrifice, but not as a demand, as a shared experience. He praised the soldiers without glorifying war. And when he said simply, "I know the burden that lies upon our men and women in uniform," he said it not as a leader above, but as someone among them. He offered not grand promises, but perspective. He reminded his listeners that, in the face of fear, there was still something constant, that even now, under rations and worry and headlines filled with maps, there were things untouched by the chaos. The warmth of a family, the quiet strength of hope, the stillness of faith. And then, in the center of his message, he paused. "We are following the command of the Prince of Peace. We are following him even over the hilltops of hate and war." The words fell gently not as doctrine, but as comfort. He wasn't asking the people to forget what they were enduring. He was asking them to remember what they were enduring for. The country had never needed this voice more. Because this was not just any night, this was Christmas Eve, a night of absence and memory. A night when the gap between what is and what used to be becomes wider. For many, it was the first holiday without a son, or the second, or the third. For others, it was the first time hearing carols with tears behind their smiles. And yet, on that evening, more than 60 million Americans gathered by their radios. They listened with candles glowing, with trees lit but quiet, with children asleep and letters unopened. They listened from hospital beds, from barracks, from bunkhouses. They listened in churches after midnight services. They listened in silence, and they listened together. Roosevelt's voice did not just narrate the moment, it accompanied it. He told them that their sorrow was real, that the world was wounded, but also that the future was waiting, and that this, even now, was still their country. A country not of fear but of resolve. It is not enough to say, "We must win the war." We must work and fight as if the whole outcome of the struggle depended on use alone. He did not soothe the nation with false promises. He lifted it with purpose. Not loud, not rushed, just steady. And then, near the end, his voice softened again. "We pray that with victory will come a new day of peace on earth." It was not a command, not a guarantee, just a quiet hope, spoken into the darkness, lit by firelight, echoing in rooms all across a weary nation. When the chat ended, the silence that followed was not heavy, but full. The kind of silence that lingers after something true has been said. The kind of silence that does not need to be filled. It is enough to be felt. Families sat for a moment longer. Fires crackled. The clock ticked. A child stirred in her sleep. A tear was wiped from a cheek. A prayer whispered behind closed eyes. And slowly, the night resumed. But it was changed. Because once again, The voice had come not to command, but to comfort, not to rouse battle cries, but to remind the nation of its soul. And so, the 1942 chat became something more than another entry in the record books. It became part of the fabric, part of the memory of that winter, that cold, bitter, quietly heroic winter. A winter when America did not leap toward triumph, but held its ground, held its breath, and held its hope together. Now, as we leave that night behind, as the sound of the broadcast fades gently into memory, as the fire burns lower in our imagined room, we carry the stillness with us. We carry the calm. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a leader can do is sit beside the people and simply say, "I am here, and so are you." Why his voice worked, tone, cadence, and the rhythm of comfort. Before the words were heard, they were felt. Before the message was understood, the music of the voice had already arrived softly, like a wave that reached the shore long before the tide could be seen. Roosevelt's fireside chats are remembered for what they said, but more than that, they are remembered for how they sounded and how they made people feel, because there was something in his voice that settled the room. Not a sound that commanded attention, but one that invited stillness. He did not speak quickly, he did not speak loudly, he didn't vary his pitch dramatically or lean on the emotional flourishes of the theater. Instead, his voice carried a quiet rhythm, like footsteps across a polished wooden floor, each syllable carefully placed. It wasn't mesmerizing in the way of performance, it was grounding. And perhaps that is why it worked. Because the country wasn't looking to be dazzled, it was looking to be steadied. If you were to listen to one of his broadcasts now, not with the urgency of a historian or the curiosity of a student, but with the hush of a midnight listener, you'd notice the shape of his speech before the shape of his ideas. You'd notice the pauses first, the space he gave between clauses, between thoughts. He allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it, and in that silence, the listener found room to breathe. His tone was confident, but never forceful. It lacked the brittleness of shouting. It lacked the calculation of salesmanship. It was the voice of someone who had considered the listener's weariness. Someone who knew that the world was heavy, and therefore chose to speak lightly, without ever losing seriousness. There was a slight nasal quality, softened by breath. A clear articulation that never strayed into sharpness. The vowels were drawn out just enough to feel full, like warm water poured into a ceramic mug. The consonants landed gently, like snow on a porch railing. There was texture, but no edge. Depth, but no darkness. And when he repeated a word or a phrase, "my friends," or "we must not forget," he did so with a tempo that lulled, not alarmed. Roosevelt had been a student of voices. He understood that sound could carry more than meaning, it could carry mood. And in the early years of radio, that mattered more than ever. There was no visual performance, no body language, no stagecraft, just the voice and the room it entered. Imagine it again. The fire is burning low, the children are quiet, the house is full of breath and hush. The radio clicks on and then, that voice, not booming, not theatrical, just present. Like a familiar companion arriving on a cold night. Like someone pulling a chair beside you and saying, "Let's talk for a moment." But there was more than tone. There was cadence, the way his sentences moved. They flowed like conversation, but with a slow, intentional structure. He rarely used complex, winding sentences. Instead, he built his thoughts one brick at a time. Statement, pause, clarification, reflection. Each block placed steadily, predictably, comfortingly. There was repetition not as a rhetorical trick, but as a gesture of trust. A way to say, "I know this part matters. Let me give it to you again," in slightly different words. And when he emphasized something, he didn't raise his volume. He lowered his speed. He let the important ideas rest in the air for a moment longer, like footprints in fresh snow. It is no wonder that people felt like he was speaking only to them. He had the gift of intimacy at scale. His voice filled a nation of rooms, but it never echoed. It settled. It landed softly, without intrusion. It became part of the room's quiet. And yet, there was more. His voice carried the weight of his lived experience. It was not the voice of someone untouched by pain. Roosevelt had been struck by polio at 39, robbed of his legs, tested by pain and isolation. But instead of growing bitter, he had learned stillness. He had learned how to speak from a place of endurance. And though he never spoke of his disability in the fireside chats, Its imprint was in his patience. He did not rush. He did not pretend. He had known what it was to lose control of the body and had learned to master the voice. There was something else, too. Roosevelt believed in the intelligence of his listeners. His voice did not talk down to the people, nor did it talk past them. It spoke with them. He never relied on slogans. He offered metaphors, yes, but always rooted in daily life. He trusted the listener to understand, and that trust, like a current beneath the words, flowed out through the rhythm of his tone. In many ways, the fireside chats were less about information than about reassurance through form. They were structured like lullabies, familiar openings, slow-building narratives, gentle conclusions. The listener did not need to remember every detail. They needed to know that someone was with them in the dark, someone who was calm, alert, unafraid. And so, his voice became a national presence. It was not the voice of a conqueror. It was the voice of a neighbor who had stayed up late to make sure the door was locked, the fire was banked, and the next morning could still arrive safely. When the war grew worse, the tone remained. When victory approached, the cadence remained. In both despair and hope, his voice did not falter or inflate. It was a constant. And that constancy became comfort, because that is what the nation needed most. Not a voice that stirred, a voice that soothed. And so, long after the speeches were filed, the transcripts printed, the historians debated, the substance, what remained in the memory of millions was simply the sound. The way it came through the speaker, warm and whole. The way it made the room feel held. Even today, if you listen to those old recordings in the stillness of night, something stirs, not adrenaline, but recognition. As if the voice is still there, waiting, saying quietly, "My friends, let's sit a while." Why his voice worked. Tone, cadence, and the rhythm of comfort. Imagine you are alone in a darkened room, the kind of room where the only movement is the slow blink of firelight on a glass frame, and the only sound is the steady hush of wind curling around the corners of your home. The kind of night when the world feels just slightly too large, and you, sitting in your armchair with a blanket drawn over your knees, feel just slightly too small. And then softly, at first, with a gentle hum and a crackle of static, the radio speaks. Not with music, not with noise, but with a voice unlike the ones you hear during the day. It doesn't rise quickly or compete with itself. It doesn't flood the silence, it joins it. It moves into the space beside you, like a familiar friend who has entered the room quietly so as not to startle you. The voice says, "My friends," and you exhale, because in that moment, you remember that you are not alone. And that, perhaps more than any policy or plan, is why Roosevelt's voice worked. It was how he spoke that changed what people heard. His voice wasn't flawless. It had textures lightly nasal, with a firm East Coast timbre, shaped by years of public life and the polished edges of patrician upbringing. But it was never stiff. It carried warmth without sentiment, distance without detachment. He rarely showed dramatic emotion, yet you could feel him listening, even as he spoke. His was not the voice of a performer. It was the voice of a person who understood how sound rests in a room, and how silence can cradle a sentence the way a shoreline cradles a wave. In every fireside chat, in every line he delivered from behind that microphone in the White House, Roosevelt's mastery lay not in performance, but in presence. He never hurried. His words came slowly, deliberately. He let each thought unfold, like a page being turned, neither too fast to lose meaning, nor too slow to lose energy. There was a patience in his pace, the kind born of long conversations on porches, or quiet evenings spent beside a hearth. He spoke as someone who knew that the world was already moving too fast for most people, and that the heart, when afraid, cannot hear unless the voice slows down. His cadence followed a quiet logic. Sentences rarely ran away from him. They had shape, balance, weight. He often placed the most important word at the end of the sentencino as a trick, but as a way of giving the listener something to land on. When he paused, it wasn't because he had forgotten the next word. It was because he understood that silence, too, was part of speech, that the mind and the heart needed space between thoughts in order to keep breathing. There is a subtle genius in rhythm that doesn't call attention to itself. You don't notice it when you're caught inside it. But Roosevelt built his messages like music. Not the kind with crescendo and flourish, but the kind that plays softly while you think. The kind of rhythm that says, "You don't need to rush to understand, I'll wait for you." He repeated phrases not to persuade, but to anchor. He would say, "We must not forget, or the strength of the American people, or make no mistake, and in saying it again, he turned it into something like a lullaby, a gentle chant against fear. Because the truth is, in times of crisis, people don't only need answers, they need ritual, something consistent, familiar, predictable. In a world where bombs fall and markets collapse and telegrams arrive with terrible news, the voice that speaks without fear of its own quietness becomes a kind of spiritual metronome. Roosevelt's speech wasn't designed to impress, it was designed to hold. And there was restraint in his voice. He didn't shout, he didn't scold. Even in wartime, when the temptation to roar must have been strong, he kept his volume steady. When a less disciplined leader might have demanded, threatened, or thrilled, Roosevelt simply spoke, calmly, unhurriedly. He knew that trust is not won with volume, it is won with tone. He spoke with the dignity of someone who had walked through fire and emerged with soft hands. It helped, of course, that he was a man who understood suffering. The paralysis caused by polio had reshaped his life. It had taught him how to live with pain, how to wait, how to listen. And perhaps that's why his voice carried such empathy, because it came not from a place of abstraction, but of embodied patience. He had learned to move slowly, to calculate each gesture, and he brought that same care into his speech. Every phrase was considered, every breath was earned. His was the voice of a man who had already survived his own private war and now offered the tools of that survival to the nation itself. There is also something to be said about distance. Roosevelt never sounded too close. His voice didn't lean in with intimacy that might have unsettled, nor did it tower from on high. It existed in that delicate space between, near enough to comfort, far enough to let the listener keep their own dignity. He never begged for trust. He simply assumed Itand. That quiet confidence, not arrogant but steadfast, became contagious. Roosevelt also knew how to listen with his voice. It's a strange thing to say, but true. When he paused, when he repeated himself gently, when he slowed for a point he knew might be difficult, you could feel the shape of the listener reflected in his speech. It was never one-directional. There was space in it for reflection, for reaction, even for disagreement. He left room for people to come to their own conclusions. That, too, is a kind of comfort. The comfort of being spoken to, not as a subject, but as a fellow human being. His voice didn't promise ease, but it promised company. It said, "You are not alone with this." It said, "Even in the dark, someone is awake and watching and speaking with care." And that is a comfort deeper than optimism. When he spoke of loss, his voice remained gentle. When he spoke of danger, his voice remained calm. When he spoke of hope, it was never grandiosite, was a kind of steady lifting, like a tide that gently carries the boat back to shore. He avoided flourish, not because he lacked imagination, but because he understood that in times of trouble, the most beautiful thing you can offer someone is clarity without alarm. The effect of his voice was not limited to the duration of the broadcast. Long after he signed off, long after the dials were turned back and the radios fell silent, his cadence remained in the room. People sat a while longer. They exhaled. They sipped tea. They put their children to bed more gently. The world, while not less dangerous, felt less chaotic because someone had named it aloud without panic. And even now, decades later, you can hear it. The recordings preserved in archives, replayed on late-night radio, still carry the weight of that rhythm. The old grainy hum, the pops of the broadcast line, the subtle drag in Roosevelt's pronunciation, they don't diminish the effect. They deepen it. They make it feel real, human, earned. You can listen to other voices from that era, commanders, generals, broadcasters, pundits, and hear their energy rise and fall with the tides of history. But Roosevelt's voice is different. It floats above the moment. It belongs to a slower time, a time when stillness was strength and calm was a kind of courage, a time when the most radical act of leadership was to speak softly and mean it. And so, his voice worked not just as sound, not just as message, but as medicine. It worked because it reminded people what peace sounds like, even when peace is far away. It worked because it gave the heart something to settle into, and like a lullaby sung over years, it became more than speech. It became memory, a voice that stayed with you long after the fire had gone out. And perhaps that is what comfort truly is. Not the absence of fear, but the rhythm that lets us breathe through it. The psychology of reassurance in times of fear. Fear is not always loud. It does not always arrive with the sharp breath of panic or the rush of fleeing footsteps. Sometimes, fear comes quietly, like a chill that settles into the room and refuses to leave. It lives in the spaces between things in the pause before a letter is opened, in the moment between turning the dial and hearing the voice, in the hush of a family gathered around a fire, not for warmth, but for answers. Fear narrows the world. It shrinks the future, and perhaps most deeply, it isolates. In the presence of fear, the human mind begins to whisper, "You are alone in this." And yet, when Roosevelt spoke during the long years of war and uncertainty, he seemed to know instinctively that his greatest task was not merely to inform the public, but to counteract that quiet, creeping loneliness. His speeches, especially the fireside chats, were not lectures, they were interventions. Soft, rhythmic, human interventions into the deepest psychology of fear. To understand why they mattered, we must first return to what fear actually does. When a person is afraid, truly afraid, the mind begins to close in, logical pathways dim. The ability to absorb new information, especially complex or abstract ideas, becomes impaired. The world becomes a series of what-ifs. The body tightens, the breath shortens. The heart beats faster, not in excitement, but in readiness for something undefined and uncontrollable. In such a state, reassurance cannot come from facts alone. It cannot come from diagrams or slogans. It must come from something more felt than understood: tone, cadence, rhythm, presence. This is where Roosevelt's genius revealed itself most fully. He did not try to override fear with volume. He accompanied it with calm. He did not pretend it wasn't real. He acknowledged it, named it aloud, gently, as if to say, "I see what you are feeling. You're not weak for feeling it. You're not wrong to be afraid. But you are not alone in it." He brought fear into the open, and then, with quiet care, placed it inside a structure. That structure was his voice. It had repetition not just for clarity, but for comfort. A phrase returned like a lighthouse beam. The American people, or "we must not forget," or "together we can." These were not just rhetorical devices, they were emotional handrails. They gave the listener something to hold on to as they walked, mentally, through uncertain terrain. Every pause he took was a breath offered to the nation. Every slowed sentence was a door he opened, not rushed, but held gently, long enough for everyone to pass through. His messages followed a pattern, and human beings, especially in times of stress, find tremendous relief in patterns. First, he acknowledged the difficulty, never minimizing, never distracting. He respected the listener's intelligence and their pain. Then, he offered clarity, explaining what was happening with simple metaphors, grounded examples, familiar language. Next, he connected. "You are not facing this alone," he would say, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through the quiet warmth of his phrasing. And finally, he ended with vision: where we were going, what we could still become, what was waiting on the other side of fear. This progression, repeated across each chat, did more than inform. It restored psychological order. And order, in the presence of fear, is itself a form of rescue. Consider, for a moment, how fear behaves when unspoken. It multiplies. It borrows its voice from silence. It imagines the worst. But when someone names it, without panic, without drama, when someone places a hand, so to speak, on the shoulder of the frightened and says, "Yes, it's real, but here is what it means, and here is what we can do," then fear becomes bearable. Not gone, but contained. Roosevelt contained fear. His tone, steady and unfailing, modeled a nervous system at rest. He never sounded like a man in crisis, even when describing crisis. And in that tone, listeners found a rhythm to mirror. Their breathing slowed, their minds opened. They began to absorb not only the message, but the mood. Psychologists today might call it co-regulation. In the 1940s, it had another name: trust. Trust, too, was not demanded. It was earned, slowly, speech by speech, through hundreds of small choices. To use plain words instead of jargon, to speak with warmth rather than condescension, to listen truly listen to the letters sent from across the country, and to reflect those voices back in his broadcasts. Roosevelt didn't guess what people needed to hear. He read it in their handwriting, heard it in their stories, received it in the way a physician receives the description of a symptom with care and a desire to soothe without deceiving. In those moments when fear spiked after Pearl Harbor, after a tough winter in Europe, after grim casualty reports, she didn't switch styles. He didn't escalate, he stayed himself. The voice didn't change, because its reliability was the reassurance. It told Americans, even if the world shakes, I will not shout. Even if the horizon darkens, I will not flinch. Even if everything else becomes unpredictable, my voice will remain slow and clear and steady. Because that, more than any slogan, is the promise I offer you. And that promise was not metaphorical, it was felt. Across the country, people reported feeling physically different after the fireside chats. Their hearts slowed, their faces softened, their sleep came more easily. It wasn't because their circumstances had changed, it was because they had changed inside those circumstances. The tone had entered their nervous system like a balm. Even Roosevelt's phrasing showed psychological care. He used we far more than I, not as a trick of unity, but as a psychological shift. We tells the brain, you are not in this alone. We tells the body, you do not have to solve this by yourself. We makes the listener feel carried. And that sensation being carried is one of the most potent antidotes to fear. He also used metaphor as therapy. A ship at sea, a team working together, a long road through darkness. These weren't just poetic choices, they were frameworks. They gave shape to the formless. They turned emotion into narrative. And when fear becomes narrative, it stops spinning in place. It moves. And when fear moves, it begins, slowly, to heal. To be reassured is not to be distracted, it is to be grounded. And Roosevelt's speeches grounded people. They brought them back to themselves. They returned their feet to the floor, their breath to its natural rhythm, their eyes to a horizon that, while distant, was still visible. That is what true reassurance offers, not escape from fear, but the strength to stay in its presence without collapsing. And this, perhaps, is why so many Americans remember those speeches not as lectures, but as companionship. They weren't being persuaded, they were being witnessed, they weren't being managed, they were being met. In a world of rationed goods and constant loss, Roosevelt gave something that could not be rationed and could not be lost. The experience of being emotionally held, not coddled. Held. So when we ask how his voice changed a nation, the answer is not only historical, it is physiological. He calmed pulses, he restored breath, he quieted restless minds. Not with spectacle but with repetition. Not with inspiration but with presence. The psychology of reassurance, in times of fear, is not about solving the fear. It is about staying with it long enough for the body to remember it is safe. And Roosevelt, through tone, cadence, rhythm, and care, stayed with his people. In fireside rooms, in hospital beds, in trenches and train stations. In the quiet ache of Christmas Eves with chairs left empty. And now, even decades later, when the world again feels uncertain, even now, when fear takes on new names and new forms, his voice remains an old recording, an echo in a quiet room, reminding us of something simple and timeless. You are afraid, but you are not alone, and this too has been survived before. Radio as a sacred object, the living room shrine. Before the television, before the digital screen, before the world unfolded itself in pixels and motion, there was the radio. And it did not blink or glow or compete for attention. It simply was, a still object in a still room. And yet, in the quiet heart of the American Homean mantelpieces, in built-in shelves, atop lace doilies, near the warmth of a fire, the radio became more than a device. It became a kind of shrine, not in the religious sense alone, though its effect was certainly spiritual, but as a focal point and altar of attention, reverence, and gathering. In an age where time moved slowly and news was measured in days, not seconds, the radio became something sacred. It carried presence. And in the darkest years of the Depression, and later, in the heaviest nights of war, the radio was not just an appliance, it was a lifeline, it was a light in the fog. And during Roosevelt's fireside chats, it became the fireplace within the fireplaceer second hearth, glowing not with flame, but with voice. Imagine it now, a wooden cabinet, chest high, with curved edges and fine craftsmanship. Often, these radios were not sleek modern boxes, but pieces of furniture solid, warm, made with intention. Some had dials surrounded by ornate flourishes. Others had fabric mesh stretched over their speakers, designed to both protect the delicate interior and soften the sound as it drifted into the room. The knobs turned with a firm resistance, the way a safe opens. And when the right station was found, it would lock into place with a satisfying click. The static would vanish, and in its place, the voice of the world clear, immediate, human. Families treated the radio with a kind of gentle formality. Not fear, not worship, but respect. It was dusted, polished. It was placed not in a corner, but in a position of prominence facing the chairs, visible from the kitchen, within reach of the main sitting area. Often, it stood near the fireplace, or even replaced it as the symbolic center of the room. And when Roosevelt's voice came through, when the president leaned in and said, "My friends," the room responded not with applause, but with stillness. Heads turned, hands fell quiet. Conversations stopped mid-thought. The room became oriented toward the sound. This is what makes the radio, in those years, more than technology. It was ritual space. It was a window, a pulpit, a confessional, a stage all in one, and yet it asked for very little. No lights, no pictures, no ads flashing across the screen, just attention, just care. Children would often sit on the floor, cross-legged, their hands folded in their laps, watching the radio as though something might appear from within it. They knew it was wood and wire, yes, but in their eyes, it held presence. A man who lived hundreds of miles away, a war being fought on distant shores, a concert performed in another city, all of it came through this box. And for many, especially those who had never traveled far beyond their county line, the radio was their connection to the wider world. It was both telescope and telescope's echo, a way to reach outward and a way to feel seen in return. And when the Fireside chats aired, the radio transformed the home. It wasn't just that Roosevelt spoke. It was where he spoke into the radio and into the room. And it wasn't just sound, it was symbol. The living room, once a space of casual comfort, became something hushed, reverent, like a chapel lit by only one candle. The fire flickered, the children leaned in, the tea cooled on the table. And the voice began. Families didn't multitask. There were no other sounds. The dishes waited, the knitting stopped, even the dog lay still, sensing the atmosphere. These weren't grand speeches shouted into stadiums. They were intimate gatherings, orchestrated by the still presence of a glowing wooden box. In this way, the radio was more than a medium. It was a vessel, like a bowl that holds water, like hands cupped around a flame. And when Roosevelt's voice poured into that vessel, what emerged was not just a message, it was memory, it was meaning. Something happened in those rooms that transcended policy. And the object itself, the radio, became a keeper of that sacred moment. People spoke about their radios the way one might speak of a trusted family heirloom. "That's the radio we had when he went to war," they would say. Or, "That's where we heard Roosevelt talk about Pearl Harbor." The voice and the object fused in memory. And even long after the war ended and the dial fell silent, the radio remained in the room, unplugged perhaps, but present, like a photograph, like a relic, a reminder of the times when sound meant solace. There's something profoundly human in the way we give meaning to objects. The cup from which our grandmother drank, the quilt sewn during a time of hardship, the letter kept folded in a drawer for decades. These things are not magical in themselves, but they hold the aura of moments that mattered. And the radios of the 1940s became sacred, not because they were rare, but because they were shared. They carried the same voice into every home. And they allowed millions of people, across vast distances, to feel if only for a few minutes as though they were sitting in the same circle. Even today, if you see one of these radios at an antique shop or in a grandparent's attic, you might feel a strange tenderness. Your hand might move toward the dial instinctively. Your eyes might rest on the speaker cloth and wonder what voices it once carried. And in that moment, you are not admiring a gadget. You are standing before a memory. A small wooden shrine, once lit by the sound of comfort in a time of cold. And it wasn't only Roosevelt, of course. The radio carried dramas, comedies, music, weather, baseball. But when he spoke, room became something different. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a visit, a gathering of hearts, a collective breath. There was a moment, at the beginning of every Fireside chat, when the room shifted. Not dramatically, but subtly. The shoulders lowered, the hands quieted, the spine straightened slightly. And the air seemed to lean in. Because what was about to happen mattered, not in the way of headlines, but in the way of home. And so, the radio stood, night after night, not just as a channel of sound, but as a keeper of peace. A steady presence in times of noise, a candle in the window. And it continues to live, in memory, as one of the few inanimate things that managed to become deeply alive through voice, through attention, through care. And perhaps that is why, even now, long after the dials have stilled and the stations have changed, the radio remains in the stories we tell about the past. It is never just described as an object. It is remembered as a place, a where, the place where the voice arrived, the place where fear was named and soothed, the place where a nation fragmented, worried, waiting gathered, night after night, around the soft hum of a speaker, and listened to a man speak slowly, calmly, clearly, like firelight finding every corner of the room. And so, the radio was never just a radio. It was a sacred object, a shrine to stillness, a shelter for sound, a room within the room. And inside, it lived the echo that still finds us. When the night is long, and the voice we most need to hear is the one that knows how to begin with. My friends, Hidden Notes, how FDR used metaphors and storytelling to bind a broken nation. Language has always been more than sound. It is texture, it is shape. It is a bridge between what we feel and what we can bear to say. And when the world grows heavy, when the news grows hard, and the path forward becomes unclear, there are moments in history when leaders reach not for charts or numbers or declarations, but for story, for symbol, for metaphor, for the quiet magic of words that do more than explain, they connect. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood this better than most. Beneath the calm cadence of his fireside chats lay a deeper current woven not from data, but from images, familiar, gentle, evocative. He did not overwhelm with abstraction. He met people where they were, with the language of kitchens and tool sheds, of boats and roads and gardens and stars. And in doing so, he turned the cold mechanisms of policy into something warm, something human. He turned fear into narrative. He turned listening into remembering. Roosevelt was a storyteller, but not in the way of mythmakers. His stories were quiet, brief, often no more than a sentence, a metaphor, a turn of phrase left to echo softly in the mind long after the broadcast had ended. He didn't say, "The economy is fragile and the banks are under strain." He said, "The people of this country want peace. They are not interested in wars of conquest." He didn't say, "We're going to impose regulatory frameworks." He said, "The money of the people, what they have in the bankies, safer now than it was before." It was not simplification, it was translation of abstract policy into living metaphor. He spoke of the nation as a ship, navigating stormy waters. He cast himself not as the admiral shouting from the deck, but as the captain steady at the wheel. "We are all in the same boat," he said more than onsono as a slogan, but as a picture the listener could hold. They could feel the boat, they could imagine the spray of the sea. They could feel the pull of rowing together. That's what metaphor does, it gives shape to the formless. It makes the invisible touchable. Sometimes he spoke of roads. This is not the end of the road. It is only a bend in the road. Such lines did not offer strategy, they offered orientation. In a time when maps of the future were blurred, he gave people a path. Not paved with promises, but with direction. To hear him speak was to feel one's own steps find rhythm again. In wartime, his metaphors became subtler, yet more profound. He described factories as the arsenal of democracy. He described soldiers not as warriors alone, but as builders of peace. He reminded listeners that liberty was a flame to be kept lit, not just a law to be obeyed. Each metaphor opened the door to a different kind of listening, one that moved through the ear and into the soul. He didn't tell people what to feel. He gave them the language to feel it. His words often lingered in domestic spaces, firesides, windows, tables. He knew the images Americans saw every day. A coffee cup on a saucer, the corner of a newspaper folded, a child's shoes by the door. And so he placed his stories there. He said, in effect, the nation is not a theory, it's your kitchen. It's your neighbor's barn. It's the laundry hung between tenement windows. That's what we are fighting for. That's where the future will arrive. And when Roosevelt spoke of time, he used it not as pressure, but as comfort. He often reminded people that the present moment, however dark, was not forever. He spoke of history as a river, long and bending, that moved forward even when the surface looked still. He called back to Lincoln, to Jefferson, to the founders, not to invoke grandeur, but to remind his listeners. We have been here before, we have walked through fire, and we have survived. Even the structure of his storytelling reflected psychological care. Each message opened gently, like the turning of a page. It moved not in sharp points, but in waves gently rising, gently falling, always returning to stillness. He knew when to linger, when to repeat, when to pause. His metaphors arrived not in a rush, but in quiet intervals. He gave the listener time to let each one land, and once landed, they stayed. There was a hidden literacy in Roosevelt's speech. Not in the academic sense, but in the emotional sense. He read the mood of the country the way a parent reads a child's face. Not just what they say, but what they need to hear. And so, rather than argue with fear, he narrated it. Rather than debate despair, he framed it. His metaphors turned pain into process. They gave shape to chaos, and in that shape, people found the courage to keep going. He never offered resolution too early. He didn't rush toward hope as a way to avoid sorrow. Instead, he sat with sorrow, spoke softly into it until the path forward revealed itself through the language. And when he finally said, "We will endure," or "Victory will come," it wasn't a sudden uplift. It was the natural conclusion to a story that had been patiently, lovingly told. Even his use of pronouncer, us, together was part of the story. It wasn't decoration, it was invitation. The narrative he told was not about a president solving problems, but about a nation walking through them as one. The people weren't spectators in his metaphors, they were characters. And that too was healing. Because when fear isolates, the greatest gift is to be rewoven into the story of something larger than yourself. In his final years, as the war dragged on and the toll grew heavy, Roosevelt's metaphors became quieter still, but they never vanished. He spoke of lanterns in the dark, of roads still to travel, of fields yet to be sown. Even when he knew his own time was running short, he used story as an act of legacy, not for his presidency, but for the people, for their children, for the future he might not live to see. And now, long after his voice has faded from the airwaves, those stories remain not as sound, but as shape. His metaphors have been folded into the national memory, like handwritten notes tucked into a family Bible, lines that return to us in difficult hours, images that rise when we need them most. Because in the end, Roosevelt's greatest storytelling feat was not just to describe the world, but to remind the people they were still its authors. And that, in its own quiet way, is how you bind a broken nation. Not with orders, not with thunder, but with a story you invite them to finish together. The White House fireplace versus the tenement stove. The fire burns differently depending on where you stand. In the White House, it glows behind carved marble, framed by columns, a portrait overhead, and a silence that wraps around each flicker like silk. There, the flames cast long shadows across velvet drapes and polished floors. The air smells faintly of aged wood and pipe smoke, and the logs are laid with care by quiet hands who tend the rooms that history sleeps in. And not far from that fire, seated in a deep leather chair, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wrapped in a shawl, a notepad in his lap, his cigarette holder balanced loosely between his fingers, would stare into the flames as though searching not just for heat, but for meaning. This fireplace, ceremonial yet comforting, was both literal and symbolic. It was the hearth of a nation, the imagined center of power and poise. And yet, at that same hour, in 1,000 towns and 10,000 neighborhoods, other fires burned lower, smaller, some barely clinging to warmth hand in front of those fires. People gathered just as they did at the White House, though their surroundings were far less ornate and their concerns far more immediate. The tenement stove did not burn for elegance, it burned for survival. In a narrow apartment, 3 floors up, in a part of the city where the sun took longer to rise between the buildings, a coal stove glowed red behind its iron door. The walls around it bore soot from years of smoke and cooking. The tiles underfoot were cracked. The window had been stuffed with rags to keep the cold from sneaking in. There were no mantles, no moldings, no aides waiting in the hallway. But the fire, small as it was no less central. It was the place around which everything revolved. Meals, stories, warming hands after a shift, drying mittens and scarves. And when the radio came on, perched atop a chip dresser or sitting unsteadily on a metal stool, the voices that entered the room did not care about the rent. They did not adjust themselves for poverty or wealth. They simply came. And Roosevelt's voice, calm, warm, even settled into these tenement kitchens just as naturally as it did the Oval Office. That is the quiet miracle of voice. It does not discriminate by decor. It does not pause at appealing paint line or whisper more gently to brocade curtains. It enters wherever it is welcomed. And so, in the same hour that Roosevelt might finish reading a speech draft beside the ornate fireplace of the White House, a mother might be finishing the dishes beside the stove that heated her entire apartment. One fire crackled behind marble, the other hissed behind rusted metal. But both held the weight of anticipation. Both warmed rooms that now quieted themselves waiting, breath held, for the president to speak. The contrasts, of course, were striking. In Washington, dinner might have included fine china and quiet silverware, a staff in pressed uniforms, and conversations about logistics, war maps, and global diplomacy. In the Bronx or Chicago or South Boston, dinner was what was left from the ration book, stretched with potatoes, served in mismatched bowls with tin spoons. The White House fireplace burned hardwood that crackled neatly and gave off a rich glow. The stove in the tenement burned coal, and the scent of it mixed with the sharp edge of boiled cabbage or reheated stew. Yet in both places, there was a common silence just before the voice began, an invisible reverence, a collective readiness to listen. Not because the speaker was powerful, but because he had earned something far more precious: trust. Roosevelt knew that his words would pass over penthouses and slums alike, through cathedral windows and laundry-hung alleys. And he chose his words accordingly. Not to pretend the differences weren't real, they were, but to speak in a tone that transcended them. He never assumed a house was wealthy. He never assumed a listener was comfortable. He didn't ask, "What do the rich need to hear?" Or "How do I calm the bankers?" He asked instead, "How does the voice land in the kitchen, in the bunkhouse, in the factory dormitory?" And so, the rhythm he used, the metaphors he chose, the stories he told, they were shaped for all ears, not just elite ones. The fireplace in the White House was symbolic, but the stove in the tenement, it was real, tangible, necessary. Children huddled near it to dry their socks. Couples argued beside it when the week's wages didn't cover everything. Widows sat with it late into the night, reading old letters by its glow. And when Roosevelt spoke through the radio, that fire, however dim, felt seen, felt acknowledged. He didn't talk down to those rooms, he talked with them. There is something holy about a fire, something eternal. Whether it burns in a palace or a tenement, it draws people close, it changes the light, it silences the noise. And so too with Roosevelt's voice. It created warmth by rhythm. It invited presence by tone. It did not demand the listener rise to meet him. He met them where they were, again and again. And sometimes, if you looked closely, you could almost see it, that invisible arc between the White House fireplace and the tenement stove. That quiet bridge made of words, stretching over cities, towns, railways, and fields. A line not of power, but of attention, a transmission of care. The fire in Washington was grand, yes, but the fires in the smallest homes were the ones Roosevelt truly spoke to. And in speaking to them, he made them feel, even if just for a few minutes, seen. Even in threadbare coats, even with worn-out shoes, even in rooms where the wallpaper peeled and the cold clung to the window panes. This is the measure of leadership, not in how well one commands from above, but in how gently one reaches down, into the quiet rooms where hope flickers and needs kindling. Roosevelt's greatest gift was not his policy, but his presence. A presence that could pass through marble and brick and soot and static, and arrive unannounced, unintrusive beside a mother holding a letter in one hand and a dish towel in the other. Beside a child tracing figures in the frost of the window. Beside a man returning home from a shift, unbuttoning his collar by the stove. And in that moment, the voice did not belong to the president, it belonged to them. So while the fires may have burned differently, one ceremonial, one essential, they were both joined, night after night, by the same voice. And that voice, slow and steady, turned those fires into beacons, into companions, into reminders that even when the world trembled, the room could still feel steady. The White House fireplace remains. So do the stories of the tenement stoves. And somewhere between them, always, there is still that voice, calmly threading its way through time, whispering once again, "My friends." How the wealthy heard Roosevelt, and how the poor needed him. There is a certain quiet that lives in wealth, a quiet not unlike the kind that fills a gallery after hours polished, climate-controlled, touched by intention. In the homes of the wealthy, during the 1930s and 40s, that quiet carried the weight of both comfort and distance. A long hallway might stretch from the kitchen to the parlor, with rugs soft enough to muffle every footstep. Curtains were thick, light filtered through silk or lace, and the air often carried the scent of waxed wood, lavender polish, and well-fed fire. In those homes, when the radio clicked on and Roosevelt's voice emerged, it often echoed in spaciousness. The listener sat in a leather-backed chair, brandy nearby, the brass knobs of the receiver polished to a dull gleam, and the voice's voice was heard not as rescue, but as reference. It was not unwelcome, but it was not necessary in the same way. To the wealthy, the fireside chats were a kind of presence check, a chance to see where the country stood and where they might, tactically, stand with it. But travel now, in your mind, to a different room, one with worn floorboards and wallpaper yellowed by time, one where warmth is held in layers of sweaters, socks, blankets because the coal is almost gone, and payday is still 2 days off. Here, the light is dimmer, not by choice, but by ration. The chair wobbles slightly when leaned upon. The stove hums with the sound of something modest, maybe a pot of barley and onion, maybe leftover beans. And here, when the same voice, his voice comes through the same frequency, the moment does not feel optional, it feels necessary. It lands not on curiosity, but on need. In this room, Roosevelt isn't just informing, he's answering, he isn't updating, he's grounding. This voice isn't commentariat's connection. And that's the quiet truth that often lingers behind the elegance of his language. Roosevelt's words fell differently depending on how much the listener had to lose. The wealthy owners of banks, of rail lines, of old names and inherited trusts listened with interest, sometimes with suspicion, often with detachment. They followed the implications. They studied the policies. They called friends and made assessments. His reforms were not always in their favor. His tone, respectful but firm, sometimes pressed into their world like a thumb against glass. And yet, even then, he did not alienate. He understood that inclusion was part of stability, that to calm a nation, one must not shout down its powerful, but speak over them clearly, consistently, without fear. But the poor, the working poor, the underemployed, the farmers whose hands cracked in the cold, the widows living off meager pensions, the families who could not stretch powdered milk another day, they didn't hear policy in Roosevelt's voice. They heard presence. They heard someone who saw them. And that, for many, was the first time such a feeling had ever arrived in the room. He didn't romanticize poverty. He didn't promise sudden escape. What he offered, instead, was respect. A voice that did not diminish their struggle, did not pity them from above, but spoke plainly and patiently and repeatedly to the reality of their days. For those with nothing to spare, the fireside chats became ritual, a break in the monotony of hardship. An affirmation that someone, somewhere, knew what it felt like to wonder how to pay for coal, how to keep shoes mended, how to stretch soup for one more bowl. And the voice they heard didn't come through ornate marble hallsit, came through a tin speaker, glowing amber with static, often surrounded by children, by fatigue, by quiet hope. There were, of course, tensions between classes. There always have been. There were wealthy voices who called Roosevelt a traitor to his kind, who saw the New Deal not as renewal, but as redistribution, who resented the tone of his calm, as though it concealed some deeper revolution. But Roosevelt's gift was that he did not shout across the DVD, bridged it slowly, over time, through rhythm and repetition. He did not ask the wealthy to become poor, nor the poor to idolize wealth. He asked only this, to sit and listen together for a moment. And in doing so, the radio became more than sound. It became a meeting place. In those moments, during the broadcasts, time and distance softened. A banker in Connecticut and a coal miner in West Virginia heard the same sentence, at the same moment, through the same box. And though their lives would remain worlds apart, for a few minutes, they were held together by cadence. The voice did not change. It did not favor. It simply continued. Steady, measured, human. It's easy, from our distance, to flatten those experiences to imagine Roosevelt as a unifier in some mythic sense. But the truth is gentler, more grounded. He was not loved by all. But he was heard by all. And in that hearing, something rare happened. Each listener, regardless of class, felt they had been addressed directly, not with slogans, not with empty reassurance, but with a tone that said, "You matter. This matters. I am here." For the rich, perhaps, That was a pause in insulation, a rare instance where the world's pulse reached through their walls. For the poor, it was oxygen. The way a plant bends towards sunlight, they turned toward the voice because it reminded them, "You are not forgotten." And so, Roosevelt did what few could. He threaded a voice between marble halls and bare kitchen walls, between silk carpets and concrete floors, between names etched on buildings and names never recorded at all. He never said it outright, but his tone carried the message. I see all of you, and I will keep speaking until you feel seen too. And maybe, just maybe, that's how healing begins, not with shouting or sudden change, but with the slow, nightly threading of one human voice through rooms that have never shared a door. The echo of his words in factories, farms, and foxholes. There's something curious about the way sound carries in different spaces. In a high-ceilinged ballroom, it ricochets and gilds itself in echo. But in a factory, it is swallowed. It blends into the rhythm of machinery, the endless, metallic breath of progress and fatigue. And yet, even there, even among the pounding presses, the whir of belt drives, and the hiss of steam, Roosevelt's voice found its way in. Perhaps it came during the break between shifts, when hands raw from oil and sweat gripped metal lunch pails and tin cups of coffee. Perhaps it came from a speaker fixed to the wall beside the time clock, or from a battered radio someone brought in, turned just loud enough to be heard above the hum. And in that moment, with grime still beneath their nails, with shoulders aching from repetition, the workers stopped moving. Just for a few minutes, they paused not because someone commanded it, but because something familiar had begun to speak. Factories during wartime were not quiet places. They did not invite introspection. They were alive with industry, tension, and haste. Women learned to rivet. Men returned with injuries and filled clerical posts. Older folks came back into the workforce, drawn by necessity and ration books. But even in that whirring urgency, there was a strange reverence for the radio when it spoke with that voice. Roosevelt's tone had a kind of humanness, slightly weary, often reflective, always firm, that cut through even the loudest engine room. And when he spoke to labor, he did not pontificate. He recognized. He named. He honored. He reminded the exhausted welder or the meticulous assembler that their effort, though unseen by generals, mattered to the nation's pulse. On distant farms where rows stretched longer than memory and rain was either too scarce or too much, the voice arrived like a weather pattern. Slowly, steadily, always somehow on time. The radio might sit on a windowsill above a sink, beside a loaf of bread still cooling in its tin. Or perhaps it was on the porch, near the rocking chair, where a straw hat rested and boots sat side by side. In these rural places, Roosevelt's words did not feel remote. They felt familiar, like something passed between neighbors across fence lines. He didn't speak of harvests or drought in lofty abstractions. He acknowledged their weight. He made room in his sentences for the slow churn of cattle, the calloused hands that worked without applause, the fatigue that did not end with daylight. For farmers, the fireside chat became less a broadcast and more a seasonal ritual. In the way one watches the horizon for signs of change, they listened for shifts in tone, in urgency, in encouragement. The president, though far away in stone halls, somehow understood the rhythm of their fields. But perhaps the most haunting echo of his words came not in homes or factories, but in places far colder, far quieter places where death was not an abstraction, but an hourly companion. The foxholes. The trenches, the foreign fields. In Europe and the Pacific, in deserts and jungles and mountains with names not even maps could spell, young men crouched in dugouts with radios huddled like lanterns. Reception was spotty, batteries scarce. Yet still, when the signal came through, even faintly, they leaned in. The voice was older than theirs, slower, American, familiar. It reminded them of living rooms with clean socks, of mothers stirring soup, of the smell of floor polish and the dull ache of algebra. Roosevelt did not glorify war. He did not shout patriotism. Instead, he offered reassurance like a steadying hand on a shaking shoulder. He said, "In so many ways, we are with you." And for a soldier afraid to sleep, unsure if morning would come, that was more than policy, it was prayer. Some would hear a single sentence before the static returned. Others caught the full message, scribbling bits of it into damp notebooks or holding onto key phrases like talismans. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That line, among others, became a whispered chant in the dark, a ward against panic. Because when bullets flew and comrades fell, It was not just strategy they needed, it was something human. And in that voice, they found it. Not perfection, not infallibility, just presence. In these ways, Roosevelt's fireside chats stretched far beyond the Oval Office. They entered the bloodstream of a nation in motion through grease-streaked uniforms, through soil-creased overalls, through canvas boots that trudged through snow and sand alike. He became, not by decree but by repetition, a kind of narrative compass. Not because his policies pleased all, or his tones soothed every heart, but because he kept showing up, he kept speaking. Through setbacks, through crises, through days when everything felt too broken to repair. The voice traveled further than trains. It crossed oceans faster than telegrams. It carried more than information, it carried continuity. And in an age where silence often meant abandonment, that continuity meant survival of something more delicate than flesh, the survival of faith. Faith in a structure, in a union, in a name written on the currency they passed to each other for bread and boots and candles. Factories, farms, and foxholes. 3 spaces, 3 daily trials, each noisy, each lonesome, each overlooked in their own way. And yet, when the dial turned and the vacuum tubes glowed amber with life, the voice entered, calmly, as if it had never left. It didn't promise comfort, but it delivered company. And perhaps, in a nation stretched thin across so many fronts, that was what mattered most. Not the words alone, but the way they returned, night after night, like an echo you never knew you needed until the silence returned. When the voice fell silent, legacy, memory, and sleep, there comes a moment, in every life, when a voice that once anchored your world is heard no more. For millions of Americans' factory workers, farmers, soldiers, mothers, students, Eldersit happened on the 12th of April, 1945. The voice that had threaded through their years like the familiar hum of an old floorboard, the voice that soothed through fear and lit the airwaves like the glow of an evening lamp, had finally grown still. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had passed away in Warm Springs, Georgia, and with him, something quietly departed from the daily rhythm of a nation too tired to cry aloud. It is strange, isn't it, how absence can be louder than presence. When a voice goes silent, the silence it leaves behind is not empty. It's shaped, it echoes, it remembers. In the hours after the announcement, radios across the country did not play the usual swing tunes or broadcast the weather. Instead, there was solemn music. Church bells rang where factories had once clanged. In some towns, children were hushed not because they were in trouble, but because their parents were holding still, staring into the distance, listening for something that would not come. At the White House, the fireplace still crackled, but there was no more scribbling of speech drafts, no more pacing with a cigarette balanced delicately between 2 fingers, no more soft murmur of revision. The room still held warmth, but the chair was empty. Somewhere, the final draft of a never-delivered speech lay folded on a desk. It would never reach the microphone. And yet, in a way, it didn't need to. The message had already been spoken, not in a single address, but in hundreds, over years, woven into the fabric of a nation that had come to measure time not in months, but in chats. People did not only grieve the man, they grieved the absence of his voice. The voice that had entered their kitchens echoed off plaster walls and sat among them like a guest who knew when to speak and when to fall quiet. He had become not just president, not just commander-in-chief, but a kind of nighttime companion. His voice had marked beginnings and endings. Children had grown up with it. Couples had heard it before embracing goodnight. Sons had gone to war hearing it. Daughters had danced under the ceiling fan with it humming low in the corner. And now, the radio dials turned to static. Nothing seemed quite as steady anymore. And yet, memory, like embers in a hearth, does not vanish so easily. The voice lingered in phrases. The only thing we have to fear, this generation has a rendezvous with destiny. I see 1/3 of a nation. These were not merely sound bites, they were stitched into conversations, quoted around dinner tables, written into journals, recited in letters from the front. In many homes, people still sat in their favorite chair at the usual hour, letting the quiet fill in where words used to be. Sometimes they played an old recording. Sometimes they didn't, but always they remembered. And as the years passed, the recordings survived. Some faded, their fidelity worn thin by time, like photographs exposed to sunlight. Others were preserved with care, digitized, restored, rebroadcast on anniversaries. New generations listened, not out of obligation, but curiosity. What was it about that voice? Why had it stirred so much hope? Why did people still stop what they were doing when they heard it? Perhaps it was the tone low, unhurried, confident without arrogance. Perhaps it was the language plain, humane, never pompous. Or maybe it was the presence, the feeling that someone who knew how to name the darkness was still willing to stand in it beside you. Not because he could chase it away, but because he refused to let it claim you completely. Historians would go on to debate his politics, his policies, his legacy. That is their task. But for the quiet listener in the stillness of night, for the elder who remembers turning the dial with trembling fingers, for the child of war, now grey-haired and listening again through headphones, the legacy is not merely constitutional or economic. It is emotional, it is auditory. It is the memory of a voice that calmed a frightened house. In time, Roosevelt's voice became less a recording and more a lullaby of the Republica pattern in the collective mind, like the whisper of wind through pine or the tide brushing against stone. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to return. And return it did, through old broadcasts, through memoirs, through voices inspired by his, through the simple act of speaking plainly in the face of complexity. And perhaps that is what sleep is too. A return to quiet, to rhythm, to a safe place in the mind where the world slows down. Roosevelt's voice was not the kind that commanded sleep, it invited it. It held your hand at the edge of worry and said, "You're not alone tonight." And now, as this chapter closes, you may find yourself drifting into that same quiet, not out of sorrow, but out of stillness. The world he knew is long gone. The war ended. The radios evolved. The Oval Office changed hands again and again, but voices like his measured, kind, enduring still echo. They echo in the spaces between our thoughts, in the hush before dreams, in the warmth of memory, and in the sound of our own breathing, steady and slow. So rest now. Let the fire burn low. Let the night carry you softly away. Roosevelt has finished speaking. And it's okay to fall asleep. The last glow of the hearth. And now, we come to the end of our journey not with a grand finality, but with a soft exhale, like the last warmth from a slowly dying fire. We have wandered gently through homes of the 1940s, into kitchens perfumed with wartime stews and walls echoing with the hum of the family radio. We've stepped softly into the quiet corridors of the White House after midnight, felt the hush of a nation leaning toward a speaker, and traced the cadence of a voice that seemed to carry both the weight of the country and the tenderness of a lullaby. We have followed Franklin Delano Roosevelt not only as a figure of history, but as a sound that once lived inside a million rooms. We have heard how he composed his thoughts in the stillness of night, how Eleanor listened first, how aides handed him fresh parchment as he revised line by line with care. We have explored how his words were more than policy, they were medicine, poured into the ears of a weary people, asking not for applause, but simply for courage. And we have seen the many places his voice traveled through mansions and tenements, across prairies and warfronts, into spaces of wealth and struggle, hope and hunger. Each time it arrived, it did not thunder. It settled, like dust on a mantle, or the hush that follows the closing of a front door on a winter night. And when that voice fell silent for the last time, it left behind more than silence. It left a rhythm, a memory, a way of speaking that lives on, quietly, in how we comfort one another even now. So here, at the close of this story, allow yourself a moment of stillness. Imagine the embers of a late-night fire, the kind that glows long after the words are gone. Imagine the sound of your own breath, matching the slow, even cadence of a long-forgotten broadcast. Imagine a room, dimly lit, with old wallpaper and a worn chair turned toward the hearth. The world outside may be shifting and uncertain, but inside, the room is warm. Time does not chase you here. Worry does not press. And in that space, you are not alone. You are part of a long thread of listeners who, once upon a time, paused to hear a steady voice in the night. You are joined, across time, with a soldier in a muddy trench, a mother washing dishes by the sink, a boy clutching a worn blanket as he leans toward the radio's warm static. You are with them, no in memory, in feeling, in the slow rhythm of the world turning softly. Roosevelt's voice may no longer fill the airwaves, but its echo remains in the way we speak gently to one another when times are hard, in the pauses we leave for others to breathe, in the honesty that soothes better than flattery, in the courage to tell the truth slowly, kindly, as if whispering through the firelight. And maybe tonight, as you drift off, you carry a bit of that with you, not just the facts of a president's life, not just the era of wartime broadcasts, but the soul of something quieter. The idea that words, chosen carefully, spoken gently, can steady a world that feels like it's slipping. So breathe now. Let the warmth of the past settle around you like a soft blanket. The story is finished. The voice has faded. The night is yours now. Sleep deeply. And when morning comes, may it arrive gently like the first glow of a hearth, long before the world stirs. Good night.